This week on Filthy Hope.
And so I think that's possibly why in the church we do want to jump to the happily ever after, because the mess of being in the midst of, a loved one dying, possibly suffering, but also, the grief that comes afterwards and that hole that death has made in our lives is hard. It's hard.
This podcast is a Uniting Heart and Soul production and was recorded on land that was stolen nearly 250 years ago. On this particular episode, we recorded on the land occupied by the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. We pay our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and we acknowledge that sovereignty over these lands was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. At Filthy Hope, we humbly contribute to the ancient and ongoing traditions of storytelling when we share stories on this podcast.
Jesus is Lord.
Hello and welcome back to Filthy Hope. If it's your first time, this is a podcast that spends time in the grey spaces where Jesus, life and culture intersect. I'm your host, Jonty. Ness is not with us today. She's on leave. We'll hear all about what she's been getting up to when she gets back. But joining me today is one of the two reverends at Turramurra Uniting and my old boss, Rev Phil Swain. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jonty. It's great to be here.
It's a bit of a thrill to have you because, like I said, we worked together for 2.5 years.
Yes.
So I spent a lot of time in the office with you, and this is the first time you've been in the office with me.
Yes.
So this is very exciting. Have you been? For people that don't know who you are, new listeners, maybe explain who you are, what your job is, all the stuff,
Sounds good. All right. Well, I'm Phil. I'm the minister at Turramurra Uniting, but I've been in ministry for nearly 22 years now. 3 different parishes. I started up at Yamba on the far north coast. Spent a fair chunk of my time in North Rocks in Western Sydney, and now in Turramurra. I grew up in rural areas, so I'm a bit of a country boy at heart. Married to Marion, and 3 grown-up kids now. I enjoy playing the guitar, not as well as you do, and
you do have a very nice guitar.
playing computer games, and just generally being with people. I'm a bit of a people person.
22 years is a long time. Can you maybe explain, or maybe take us back to what drew you to, or maybe what that calling was into ministry? What was going on in the world of Phil that led you into that path that you're now a couple of decades down?
There were 2 key things that was happening. I knew probably from about 18, 19 that I'd end up in ministry. Part of that was I loved being involved in my local church. Whether it was a good thing or bad thing, they let me preach from a young age. They let me be involved in the different aspects of what the church was doing, and including reaching out to the community. And I just loved it. And I used to joke that my other work was how I earn money so that I could do my church work, which I loved. And that part of that idea of feeling that call to ministry was to do what I loved. But also, if you talk about what's my goal in life, it's to be helpful and influential to people and situations. And I just think the work that I do matches well with that life goal. I want to be helpful and there for people, and I want to try and make a difference in the communities I'm involved in. And the calling that I have just helps me to do that.
I resonate with that deeply. I think I'm in a weird position now where I'm almost getting paid to do the thing that I love, as opposed to being paid so I am free to then do the thing that I love. But that's the money thing is always a complex thing to wrestle with in ministry. One of the things that we are taking part in at the moment at Turramurra Uniting is the Growing Young program, which listeners or regular listeners will be familiar with that phrase and the Green Book, if you're interested in diving really deep into what that is and what it looks like, I believe it was last year sometime, with with Malk, we spent an hour and a half unpacking it and what it looks like and the road that has led the Uniting Church to where it is now with young people. But I'd be curious to ask you, what has the process of going through this Growing Young program, which actually before we do that, I should just say, for people that don't know, a really brief overview is that it is a book developed by some researchers from the States, looking at some data-driven research into how churches of all different sizes are engaging with young people in a meaningful way. And so the book provides a really practical step-by-step way to quote-unquote grow young in terms of maintaining and re-engaging young people in the life and witness of the church. Is that a kind of a good way of framing that?
It certainly is. Like the challenge that we have is that every year churches grow older because we all grow
older,
year older.
Yeah.
So if you look at the average age and wonder why the average age is going up, it's because we grow older. Yeah. And so there has to be this intentionality in going, if we want to grow young, even in that really literal sense, what we have to do is to be engaging with people who are younger than us and incorporating them into the life of the church, whatever that means, the life of the community or that we're exploring faith in. And so that's the challenge that we have. And if, I don't know, at Turramurra, we already do stuff with young people, but we realise that if we just keep doing what we're doing, we'll just keep growing older. And so there was that sense of, do we need to revisit how we engage young people? Do we need to maybe reimagine or recalibrate some of the stuff that we do to help continue to do that well? Just because we might be doing some aspects of that okay now doesn't mean that will continue like that. So that's why we undertook the program and found it a really interesting and helpful process. Not only the book, which you're quite right, the 6 steps of the Growing Young Wheel give some really good insights into not only what's helpful for a church, but what's helpful in engaging young people. The ones that I love are things like, taking Jesus' message seriously. If we're not just a church that has our own theology, but what was Jesus doing and how do we actually put that into practice? And if you look at the way that young people are engaging with spirituality, it's almost like, we'd rather follow your example than hear a talk any day.
Yeah.
And so you're right. Those 6 steps are really helpful, and we explored that at Turramurra over the last month. But the larger underlying bit was, what does this mean for us? If we take these 6 elements or core principles that the book put forward, what does that mean for us as a church in the way that we currently do things, in the way that we are looking into the future of how we empower or engage young people in the life of the community.
And I'm really curious to hear from your perspective. Just for one example, at time recording, within the last week, we had a dessert evening, I guess would be the best way of describing what we sat around and ate dessert together and talked about some of this stuff, which was open to and included people from, I'm trying to think who the youngest there was, probably 19 or 20 all the way through to probably 70s or 80s, I would assume.
Yes.
From your perspective, I'm curious, having been through this process or the program of growing young, and it kind of, acknowledging that there is still lots of work to do and things in place that we're going to be looking to do in the future as well. But at that as a kind of, not an end point, but maybe a focal point after 4 weeks of sermons and programs, maybe what do you think was the goal with an evening like that, and maybe what do you think were some of the lessons and the outcomes that we saw as a result of that?
Well, the goal of that night was to not let this just be a talk fest. And so after 4 weeks of focusing on the content, so to speak, it was where do we take this from here? And part of that evening was to actually practice what we preached. You know, another one of the wheels is how do we actually have real empathy for each other? How do we put ourselves in the different generation shoes to actually understand where we're coming from and where they're coming from? And, you know, I still go back to one of the early conversations I had, even before the program started, with a Bible study group who were talking about, you know, why don't young people get into the housing market? They just have to sacrifice like they did.
Yeah.
But to actually then help them see, you know, not only how hard it is, but young people now look at life differently. Their goals in life are not just a matter of, you know, getting married, settling down, buying a house and having kids, but there's other things in their life goals as well. And to see these people sort of, you know, have their eyes open to, oh, I never thought of it like that. And how do we make those opportunities where we can have those conversations where you start to realise, oh, I'm beginning to understand a little bit more where you come from. And instead of making the assumptions about why you think the way you think, that I can actually understand it in context of the things that you're sharing with me. And so part of the dessert evening was to sit around and have those conversations and allow that to organically happen. But yes, I thought it was good in the sense of, you know, when we were saying, where do we take this from here? Do we, you know, get a team together to help move this forward, to make sure that we're actually doing some of these things and people are going, yes, I want to be part of that. But the one that encouraged me the most is when we said, should we have another one of these dessert evenings and continue this conversation together, or getting that intergenerational stuff happening? There was great enthusiasm for that. And so to me, it's I'm not sure if we had an ultimate goal of that evening, but those two things that came out of it was encouraging to say, this is a process that we have to keep moving through. And even when we think, oh, we've done it, you know, this is going great now, we probably have to start the process all again. Because, as I said, if we do nothing, we just naturally grow older each year.
Well, one of the moments for me that really stood out was having a conversation with someone roughly my parents' age, and hearing a story from them that was almost exactly mirroring how a lot of my friends are feeling about church now, and kind of going, oh, yeah, sure, we have this natural degree of separation in terms of our age, but the experience of being a person wanting to engage in the church and have meaningful relationships with people within the church and have ownership and feel really connected, that's the same. Like, and I think it's slightly, and I know some people have an issue with even just the name of the book, Growing Young, but I think the point of it isn't that we should be halving the average age of people in the church. It's more acknowledging that we are all growing and how to keep engaging with the childlike enthusiasm and faith that we had when we were younger, and that will naturally feed into how we engage with young people because we're empathizing with them more and we're thinking about life from their point of view. And I even know, like, as a youth group leader, I'm constantly feeling old just from the conversations that I have with people that aren't even 10 years younger than me.
Yes.
And so I have deep empathy as well then for people who are 10 years older than me, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, kind of going, I struggle to engage with teenagers and I'm in my mid-20s, let alone the huge cultural divides that we have built up over time with different generations. I was curious as well, we were talking off mic about that cultural difference, especially in when we talk about church, that kind of exists between generations. And I don't really know what the best way of reconciling that is, but at the same time I kind of go, I don't think we need to, because I think there are lessons to be learnt in both directions.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, look, I would agree. I think sometimes, you know, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. My parents grew up in the 50s, 60s. and church did work a certain way then, but I think every generation is going, we want to be trying something, innovative, or we want to be looking at how this best works in the culture that we find ourselves in. And so we're constantly looking at what we can learn from that. The danger is where we go, what we found works well for us, and so we're going to try and hang on to that. And so I agree, growing young is more than just the literal growing young. It's having that openness and that passion to be able to continue to explore where is God at work and how do we be a part of what God is doing, not just bound to what has worked well for us in terms of church life or engaging with God or missional activities, whatever.
Yeah. And it's also something that I'm wrestling with a lot is it's not as simple as how many bums can you get in seats. We were talking on the way here about take your pick. There's all these fresh, new expressions of church popping up all over the place. But more often than not, you see it explode for a few months and then peter off again.
Yeah.
So it's clearly not just about how many people can you get in a building, how many people can you bait through the gate with pizza. So, what do you think are some of the key things that are like that bedrock, that foundation of if you're going to make church or whatever church looks like, faith communities, if you're going to make them relevant and meaningful and theologically sound and all the stuff, but in a way that's actually going to last in the same way that, we talk about the boomer generation had this cultural center of their life was church. That doesn't exist anymore. So this is a huge question that we could talk about for hours and hours and hours.
To me, there's two aspects to that. And one side of it, I remember my youth group leader teaching me the funnel theory, which is this sense of as wanting to engage people spiritually, there are ways of engaging large crowds. And if you look at the story of Jesus, speaking to the 5,000, I don't think they're expecting those 5,000 then to turn up at synagogue the next Sunday. That was a way of engaging a large group of people outside the normal church structures. And that's part of that how do we, like a funnel's got a large lip at the top, how do we catch a lot of people? But I remember my youth group was saying the bottom of the funnel is discipleship, which is what we're called to do, make disciples of all people. And how we do that, is important. So we sort of have these ways of engaging with a lot of people, ultimately to find who wants to go through the discipleship process to get to know Jesus personally, but also what does it mean to walk in the way of Jesus, to do the things that Jesus did, to understand the teachings of Jesus and to ultimately help others understand that as well. That's the discipleship process. And whilst for many years we would say Sunday worship as a core element of discipleship, that's only because that's what worked in that generation. As I was saying, for Jesus, I don't think the core element of discipleship was, synagogue that you went along to once a week. It was actually the come and follow me. Be part of what I'm doing was the discipleship process. Yeah. And so what does that mean for us now? So I agree with you. I don't think it is about getting bums on seats, even though that gets to the other side of it, which I'm just about to get to. It's how do we find ways that we can disciple people well in our current context? The problem with that, the other side of that, is that we now live in a world that needs governance because we have seen so many good ideas go off track when there's not good governance.
Yeah.
And that's where the institutionalised church really does the job well. Well, we've got better at it. I don't think we've always done it well. But it does give us a framework to be able to, think about how we make sure that, our leaders have got ethical standards and all this sort of gear, that we make sure that we are paying the people who are doing this ministry okay. Yeah. Stuff like that. There's a governance involved in it. The people aren't misusing money. And so how you bring those two things together is tricky. we look at the normal ways that we've done that for the last 100 years, which is Sunday worship and councils and boards and all that sort of stuff. But if you're doing new, innovative expressions of ministry over here, which might be discipleshipping people, how do we link that into a structure that continues to support and encourage and empower and do things well, and make sure we don't do things unwell, is hard to bring together. But that's the challenge that we are facing. And growing young picks up on parts of that. But I think that's a question, as you said, it's a huge question for the wider church at the moment. What does it mean to be able to release a whole bunch of new ideas or new initiatives that I agree is engaging people in the discipleship process well, or just engaging people spiritually in the top of the funnel idea, but at the same time structure that in such a way that we're keeping people safe and we're doing things in a way which is right and just. Yeah.
And has the legs and infrastructure to be robust for a long time.
Yes.
And not fall apart when it starts to grow. I love the idea of the funnel because I always remind myself and remind others, Jesus drew a crowd. He was charismatic and was able to communicate ideas on a large scale to lots of people. And you kind of go, you hold that in one hand and then hold the standard church service on the other hand and go, I don't see a huge crossover there between how Jesus communicated the gospel en masse to so many people and how we do that at church. That's a whole other thing. And that's not to say it's bad, it's just different. But in terms of
I don't think, Sunday worship can be attractional and can be engaging and can be the funnel part of that. But I don't think it's wrong if you've got a good church service that draws 20 people together and you disciple each other well. If that's part of the discipleship program, I don't think that's a problem with that as well. I just think we need to be looking at both,
Yeah.
What does it mean to still be reaching out beyond us like Jesus did and engaging with people and helping people see the reality of what God is doing and the reality of what Jesus is offering, which is life. If that doesn't happen on Sunday morning, instead you're doing that elsewhere, and Sunday morning is good for those 20 people, then that's okay.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
But it doesn't have to all be on Sunday morning, or it doesn't have to be, Sunday morning we get rid of and we do it all over here.
Yeah.
We got to work out what's right for us and in the context that we're doing, God's work in.
Yeah. I think I was really, really, really resonating with that almost not conflict, but the overlap between the freeing up to do new expressions of faith, that really has to overlap at some point with something that the church does well that you identified. And I look at our friends over in the Anglican Church are elite at this. I mean, you just look at their attendance and their engagement and their level of discipleship, and you kind of go, they're clearly doing something very right, is the governance and the infrastructure side of it. What I've found, and I think is something that I'm discovering more and more, is it's all well and good to have, and I don't want to make this about age, but so often it just naturally is, the young person with the idea, and with all good intentions being given the backing and the resourcing of whether it's a church council or something else, but then they still have to do the thing through the lens of the infrastructure, which is being implemented by largely because of just the year that we are in and the demographic spread of people that are in church, people that are used to what that old infrastructure has brought about and what the outcomes of that infrastructure have been for so long. So it's almost, and I look at Turramurra as an example of somewhere that does this particularly well. It's not just about giving the fresh gospel-oriented expressions of faith a young person to run it, but it's also then about putting people who are just as passionate about it into the infrastructure as well to make sure that it doesn't get not warped, but I guess dampened by then you've got all this excitement and passion and drive and vision, and then it has to go through this the machine of whether it's a church council or whether it's whatever other form of governance, because the people doing that with all best intentions don't have that same vision. And I look at Turramurra as that's just one of many great examples where I kind of go, well, you've got the people in the system as well who are able to see that vision and are equipped to empower that well in a way that will not switch that vision up.
I talked to some of my colleagues who are in similar churches who are trying our hardest to be innovative or have those new expressions. And we talk about this tension of almost having two churches in one, that you have to do I don't want to call it traditional because that gives a different idea. The normal understanding of what church is, because like we still have people who engage well with that and grow well with that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But at the same time, we see this need to do the new expressions and to be engaging beyond this normality that we've grown up in. And so you have these two versions of churches, and that you're almost having this tension between where do you share your time, where do you share the resources, and how do you empower both is tricky. Because you're right, because the people who are interested in governance are not usually the people who are interested in doing the new expressions of worship. Yeah. And so, you do have people making decisions about, how do you allocate resources that may not see the same way as the people who are doing the new expressions. Yeah. And how, going back to growing young, how do we actually spend some time with each other and learn where each other comes from? I had to learn as a young person, because I was a person who always had my head in the clouds, that my treasurer was actually a good person, because they sometimes pulled me back down and put my feet on the ground and said, yes, you can do some of that, but you can't do all of that. Yeah. And I had to learn that lesson myself. They weren't trying to be constrictive. They were actually trying to be helpful in helping me to see how to bring those two things together. Yeah.
Yeah. It's almost like the image in my head is like a good line producer on a film set, being like you can kind of see them as the person that's always saying no, or you can actually see them as the person who is providing you the best opportunity to do the thing to the best quality possible within the limited resources available. Yes. One is a very reductive, negative view of something, and the other is much more seeing them as they're actually doing their best to provide for you in the way that is going to nourish and provide that outcome as effectively as possible.
But what you just said is a challenge for people my age and older in the church. We need to be doing what you just said, rather than, we know what we're talking about and you don't, if that makes sense. So, I would say the church has not always been good at doing that. And that is the challenge, that we need to be able to go, well, how do we maybe use the wisdom of experience? I sound like an old person saying that. But at the same time, allow the passions and the ideas to flourish. Not just say no. It's a challenge.
It is, yeah. But like you say, it's a balance, because at the same time, if you just say yes to everything and let a thing charge ahead before it's properly prepared and provided the right structure, it most likely isn't gonna, because it doesn't have the knowledge and the experience of the previous iteration that has been through not the same literal experiences, but been through those same processes of making something like this, whatever expression of faith that it is, making it work and making it. A friend of the show again, Mulk, always uses the phrase, if you're trying to figure out how to disciple people, it's as simple as more people, more like Jesus. And I kind of go, that's a real simple thing to say, but how do you then flesh that out into something that will hold up? It's not just this big blue sky vision of, we'll have 3,000 people in this tent and we'll worship once a month and it's going to be sick. Like, great, that's a good goal to have for whatever steps you have in between there and then. But like, if you take it back to more people, more like Jesus, you can filter it through that lens and then apply good governance underneath and financing and all the stuff, which is not as exciting to talk about and think about, but it's so important because otherwise it's not going to work.
And I think we also need to accept that not everything's going to work anyway. I give credit to I call them older people when I was growing up, but they were my age that I am now. and I remember having a conversation many years after them saying, thank you for letting us try things. And they said, well, we didn't always think they were good ideas, but, part of their role, they said, was to allow us to try and be there to help us if we failed or be there to celebrate us with us. So it's allowing a little bit of guidance, but also, trying and failing is not necessarily a bad thing. As long as you've got a good support structure around you to pick you up and allow you to try again.
Yeah, I would say it's almost necessary.
Yeah.
Like if I'm looking at putting my creative hat on, I kind of go, it's actually necessary for you to get the 5 terrible songs out so you can get to the 6th one that's good.
Yeah.
And we're not, we're possibly not going to find the next big, I don't think something like this will happen again, but like you look at something like the Billy Graham movement in the last century, something like that, if it is going to happen again, won't happen if the next movement, if people ask whoever is involved in that is too scared to try because, well, if it's going to fail, it's not worth doing. No, make the mistake and then try again, learn the lessons, and I don't want to harp on too long about this because I do talk a lot about the future of the church on this podcast, but I guess where do you see some of the exciting signs of, like, I often find when I talk to people about this topic, it tends to become a bit doom and gloom. If you look at the statistics of the demographics spread of the Uniting Church particularly, it doesn't look great. But where do you see the hope for that stuff starting to change and sprout new life?
Yeah, good question. 2 things encourage me. Firstly, I don't think the church will ever die. I mean by the church, I mean the movement of Jesus.
Yeah.
Will ever die, because I think there's something, it brings life. It's like Peter saying, where else are we going to go? This is where we found life. So that won't die, but the institutionalised church is going through a huge challenge at the moment. It may be interesting to see where the future of that lies. If you're talking about my personal hopes, the thing that I'm feeling very stirred up about at the moment is how we work together. And that's not only within a church, but churches together work together. And I think this comes from my rural background. The rural church went through this 25 years ago, realising that if we try and do everything in our own silo, it's too hard. And so, we realised if they've only got 5 kids in our church, how do we do big things together for those 5 kids so they can at least get together with 50 kids?
Yeah.
So the rural church has been doing that for a long time, and even across denominations where they're going, it's better to have one church of 15 people in a town rather than 3 churches of 5 people. And so we've been looking at those opportunities to work together. And I think that particularly in Sydney, we have that challenge that some parts of Sydney, there's a church every, 2 kilometres. And what does that mean? To sort of say, we've invested over the years a lot of resources in this area. How do we look forward and say, what's the best way of using those resources now? And I'm not sure if it means, having those little churches continuing to do little pieces of ministry. I'm not talking about closing down churches either. I'm talking about how do we work together. And whether that's going back to the old, circuit or parish model where you sort of say, let's do some things together like governance but we continue to do our own local mission. But that can be expanded over a distance. What does it mean to do, some sort of hub ministry with rural churches? We might be hundreds of kilometres apart, but in a way of being able to resource and encourage and share what we're doing together. We've talked about, we might write a really good Easter Bible study. Why are we doing that and the person down the road doing that? How do we begin to find ways of working together? And I think the more the church finds out at the moment, I think the stronger we will be. As I said, that's not only within the Uniting Church, although I think it's particularly important in our denomination, but also across churches as well. How do we work with each other in a way that shows that, we are all one in Jesus?
And the challenge that I identify in that, and something that I am just as guilty of, is the tendency we have to want to put our own flag in the ground.
Yeah.
And there's humility and, I think that there's deep humility involved in letting the spiked gates down around our castles and allowing different church groups to work together. That I think it largely isn't something that is done with any malicious or inherently negative intent. It's just we're naturally used to building up our ministries and our churches, and there's kind of the thought sometimes of going, let's share it with another church. There's almost like that clinical business-like perspective comes into play where you're like, okay, but what are we getting out of it? And where it actually requires, no, we're all part of the kingdom.
There is a level of fear in that too.
Definitely.
We try and hold on tightly because if we let it go, what happens then? I read an article a long time ago that used a medieval analogy to talk about the future of the church, and it talked about how sometimes we want to build the strong castle with the strong walls that are very clear, and that does work. You mentioned our Anglican friends before. They do that model really well because it's easily definable. What they believe, what they think, what they do. It's like that strong castle, and that's a good thing. But this article also said, that there is a place for the medieval fair that's in the paddock next door, where different people come together, and there's not just one tent, but lots of different tents and lots of different conversations happening because of the people who are there, and people come and go, but something happens in that place too, and I'm interested to see how the church embraces that sort of model, which we can sit next to a tent which we may not totally agree with, but listen to them and see what we can learn or grow or even do together.
Simon Hansford, again, friend of the show and outgoing moderator, said something on this podcast about a year ago now that still I think of. A farming analogy of, some farms farm their stock with fences and others farm with watering holes. And he's talking about this in terms of a lot of church governance and church politics is all about where the fences are.
Yes.
Whereas if we actually think about the church as a watering hole, it doesn't matter on which side of the watering hole you're coming in from or how long you're staying there for. It's entirely down to the idea of you come to the watering hole because it brings life.
Yeah.
And so many, we're going through the process of unpacking what a voice to parliament looks like at the moment. And again, I kind of look at a lot of the discourse that happens, not just in the church, but particularly in the church, and kind of go, is this just another fence that we're arguing and going back and forth over when we should be focusing on the quality and the accessibility of the watering hole? I don't know, I find that.
And do our arguments bring life?
Do people who are maybe interested in the church look at a church and see everyone arguing and go, now that's a church I want to be a part of? It's certainly a challenge. But I you know, it's easy to look at it and throw your arms up. But I think there's, like you said, there's still lots of hope. I think.
In my analogy, don't get me wrong, there is a place for castles.
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. They're important.
Yes, but I think there is also a place for that interaction, that medieval fair where we do come together and do things together.
Yeah. Before we move on to our next section, I was the other thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently is, and forgive me if I've got this slightly not correct, but this the Jewish rabbinic tradition of how people talk about issues is about sitting around a table, and instead of getting from A to B, it's actually about the issue, whatever the issue is. Let's take voice to parliament as an example. It's about circling it in a spiral, getting closer and closer and closer. So it's not about going from, okay, we're at A, or I'm at B, this person's at A, we need to get them from A to B. It's more about we're both circling around this issue and we're seeing it each time we go around, we're seeing it from a different perspective. And it's not about convincing the other person that they're right or wrong. It's actually, we'll see everyone down at the bottom of the spiral at some point, but we're all at different points and we can learn from everyone else being at different points in the spiral downwards towards whatever the capital T truth is. Not that I think that's a whole podcast in itself. Yeah, but I think that's another thing that when I look at Western Anglicanized church culture, the arguments and the debates around so many things, it's like, are we just trying to get people from A to B, or are we actually embracing the fact that we're all still in the process and we'll all have different, because we're all at different perspectives.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or is the cycle, the spiral that we're in, an inward spiral, or because of our arguments, it's become an outward spiral, and every time we go around, we're a little bit further apart.
Yeah.
Which is the problem I see in some of the conversations we have. We're becoming more divisive rather than drawing close together. Yeah.
So I guess to shift this to a slightly different topic, Ness and I have started these weather report episodes where we check in with each other and see how we're going. So I'd be curious to ask you, one of the things that I'm really curious, especially with people in ministry, is what are the challenges that you're facing at the moment? What are the friction points that you're encountering, whether it's in ministry life or adjacent or anything related, you know?
Well, I could talk about ministry, but I think I need to talk about life rather than ministry at the moment because, well, as you would know, but the listeners possibly don't, I've had a fairly ordinary last 6 weeks. My younger sister was diagnosed with pancreas cancer and died 5 weeks later. And so the shock of not only having a diagnosis like that, but, you know, for it to, result in her dying only 5 weeks later was just, it's still hard to get my head around. And whilst that's now 2.5 weeks ago, it's just dominating my thinking and where I'm at the moment. And it's hard, you know, I've made this comment off air to you before, you know, you would think that as a minister and the fact that I've journeyed with so many people going through end of life and death and grief, that I should be good at this, but I'm not. You know, when you're in it yourself, it's harder, it's different, and trying to hold the head knowledge that I have or the experience that I've had of journeying with people and trying to apply it to my own situation has been tough. You know, it's been tough watching my parents grieve. It's been even though I can hold on to some blessings, you know, was I able to spend some good quality time with my sister before she died? Yes. You know, was the funeral uplifting and helpful? Yes. But yeah, you know, there's part of me that wants to say this is life, but it's a crappy part of life. And I can just find myself just really struggling with trying to both grieve, but what does that mean for me, and what does that mean moving forward? All of that. So I don't know if I answered your question. How am I going?
Yeah, no, certainly, and you know, we were also talking earlier about not just in church, but just in general, we're not great with acknowledging the grief part. Like, especially in churches, we it's almost, and I wonder if it's because we've been trained to, because of how much it can hurt, we jump to they're in a better place part of it. And
Yes.
and I'm sure you will well know, having been in ministry for as long as you have, that process can, and having been through it myself as well on a number of occasions, it's almost like a lot of the time we don't want to handle that first part. But I often think of like the Easter weekend as a great metaphor for that. We don't get to Sunday for 2 days.
Yeah.
Like, there's still 48 hours, depending on how you view the literal time frame there. But and more recently at Easter, I am spending more time acknowledging and sitting in Saturday. And I don't know. I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Look, I agree. I think, you know, our Christian faith gives us hope, and that's a good thing. You know, I struggle with attending non-Christian funerals because sometimes there isn't that hope there, and it's hard to, you know, it's good to grieve with hope. But I think you're right that sometimes we do just jump straight to the happy ever after part of the story. That yes, we'll all be reunited in heaven one day with Jesus, and so therefore everything's fine. But it's not fine. And not when you're sitting in the middle of it. It's not fine. You know, I'm sad over, you know, what I had with my sister, and you know, the point now is that I no longer have that in this life, and so therefore I grieve over what was still to come. I miss the phone calls. I miss that interaction. Whether that was both good and bad, you know, but still, it's not there anymore. And so I look forward with hope, but I'm grieving that loss now.
Yeah.
You know, and we shared earlier that in Western society we don't do death well. I think other societies have got a better understanding of how to do end of life and death well. I see so many people, just wanting not to acknowledge. You know, you might be sitting in a room with somebody dying and the family's still talking about it. That's okay, we'll pray for healing. You go, sit in this moment. They're dying. This is a special, sacred moment. But we're not good at that. And so I think that's possibly why in the church we do want to jump to the happily ever after, because the mess of being in the midst of, you know, a loved one, you know, dying, possibly suffering, but also, you know, the grief that comes afterwards and that hole that death has made in our lives is hard. It's hard. And as I said, I know some of the head knowledge, but it's hard when you're sitting in the middle of it.
Yeah.
You know, an example of that, I've sometimes when I do a funeral, I found this analogy when I was going through my Bible college that somebody said, you know, death of a loved one is like breaking a vase, and it doesn't matter how well you glue it back together, it will never quite be the same again.
Yeah.
And it's like that when somebody we love dies. Life is not the same again. That doesn't mean life doesn't go on. Life does go on, but it's not the same. And that's why we grieve. And so like I know that, but at the moment, I'm just looking at all these broken pieces at the moment going, crap, what do I do with this?
The knowledge of it doesn't make it easier to experience.
No.
Yeah.
And you know, there are days where I am enjoying the normality of life, you know, almost like, the vase has been glued back together again. I know that it's different now, but now I'm enjoying, life is normal-ish. And then there'll be other days where you suddenly realise, but I put the first bit of water in that vase and it just collapses again. And you sort of go, I'm not there yet.
Yeah.
And, anybody who's been through grief knows that you have these cycles not only is it hard for the person going through it, it's hard to be supporting people who are going through grief because you're never quite sure what's going to be helpful to say on what particular day.
I'm certainly experiencing that at the moment in supporting people very close to me going through a similar, a period of grieving, and that it's almost like you're scared to say the wrong thing, but you want to be helpful.
Yeah.
And it's really, and that's, I think, possibly just another symptom of us not being particularly great at doing death is we then aren't always entirely sure how to be helpful in that space either.
But one of the big learning experiences I had in my life was when I was doing my training for ministry. I spent 11 weeks in Westmead Hospital as a student chaplain, and me being young and naive and passionate, when they said, where do you want to work? I said, oncology. I don't know why I said that. and so they put me on the oncology ward to visit people going through cancer. And I just learned so much during that time. But one of the impacting things was, walking in and spending time with this family whose 18-year-old daughter was dying, not because of cancer, but because of the result of the treatment that she had. The treatment caused lung issues that meant that, she was dying. And I walked in and I heard the story, and as I explained to my supervisor later, I was saying, I didn't have any words to say. I couldn't say anything. I felt like anything I could say at this point would fall flat. And my supervisor said, well, what did you do? I said, well, I just sat there. I couldn't quote Bible verses. I couldn't do anything. That was my line to him. I couldn't do anything. He said, well, maybe that was the best thing. And that understanding there is a difference between doing and being. And as my supervisor explained, I was actually being with them.
Yeah.
And that was probably enough in that moment for them. Anything I could do probably wouldn't have impacted them. Maybe even me being there probably didn't impact them much, but it was the right response in that moment. I don't know. I think good communication with somebody in grief is critical.
Yeah.
To say, what do you need? Do you need me to not talk about this for a while?
Yeah.
My wife jokes that I've been escaping into my computer games a bit of late. And there is a reason for that, because I don't want to think about it. And if I play my computer games, I'm not thinking about the grief.
Yeah.
And so maybe there are times when, you're dealing with somebody in grief and it's a bit like, well, what do you need? Do you want us to not mention it? And there'll be other times where it is, no, I just want you to sit with me or in this moment, or, I'm ready to talk about this now. Yeah.
Yeah. There's an analogy sort of formulating in my head, and this will come to no shock as regular listeners. I'm a big old movie nerd. But, I wrote a paper in university about the difference between ghost stories in Western cinema and in Eastern cinema, particularly in Japanese cinema. And so often in Western cinema, the whole point of the ghost story is that the ghost is an antagonistic force that needs to be confronted and defeated. Whereas the more traditional understanding of ghost stories is that the ghost is a representation of something, whether it's literally about death or whether it's about something else, that needs to be reconciled. And I think that's a really interesting depiction of, in Western culture, we see death as this almost villain that we have to either defeat or ignore or somehow suppress, whereas in particular, like in Eastern cinema, you look at all those classic ghost stories, and it's about actually acknowledging and reconciling and coming to a place of being at peace with whatever the thing is. And that's something that I don't think I'm terrible at acknowledging, whether it's grief about the passing of a loved one or whatever, acknowledging that grief as something that is actually a necessary and important part of life and growth, and coming to a place where you can be at peace with it and acknowledge it for what it is, and not treat it as something that's there to antagonize you or be a threat to you.
I totally agree, and I think that even happens before a person dies. You know, that end of life stuff is such a sacred time that if we can realise that we're in that moment with the person, how do we make the most of that? And I said beforehand, I quoted a book by Mary Jane Lynn called Healing the Dying, which she's a nun who talks about how we can have good conversations with somebody who is dying, by asking questions like, what are the things that you're thinking about now? What are your memories that are coming to mind at this important end of life stuff? I did that with my sister. I said, do you remember any of our holidays? And we were suddenly laughing about the holidays that we had as kids growing up, tapping into those special moments. Or is there anything that I need you to do? Is there anything that you want me to say to somebody or give to somebody? How can I be your hands or your voice in this very special end of lifetime? But that requires us to embrace what is happening, and not be scared or feel like we have to defeat that. You're right.
Yeah. And you mentioned non-Christian funerals. I even find Christian funerals, I've been to a couple recently, sometimes a bit odd, because I think there's almost this unspoken dissonance between whoever's delivering a message or whatever the funeral's looking like, speaking so confidently, like you said, about embracing the hope and the anticipation of being reunited in heaven, that is at odds with the immediate feeling in the space often of, that's all well and good, but I'm in the middle of grief and I've lost someone, and being reminded of, like, in the future you'll be reunited with them, so that's really fantastic. Particularly one recently, I remember sitting there, not actually being, I was there as a musician and just observing and really feeling like there was this unspoken dissonance in the room where there's this unacknowledged almost elephant in the room, that we're actually here to gather. We're actually gathered to mourn, as well as great funerals celebrate the life of the person. And I just wonder if that's also something that we aren't great at in that process.
You triggered a memory within me. In my last church, fairly early on, I was doing a funeral of a 19-year-old, very tragic death. And I knew this person, I knew all their friends from teaching scripture and youth group, because I had crossed my path. So they asked me to do the funeral because I'm the only person that they knew who sort of did that. But none of these people went to church. And I'm trying to work out, how do I do a funeral, basically a non-Christian funeral, because they're not interested in the Christian stuff. I did mention that, but it was largely non-Christian. And I thought, look, I'm just going to have to do what I thought was going to be, the stereotypical stuff that we sometimes do with young people. So I had candles I could light. I had, something they could write a message on. And this was back in the era you could still release helium balloons. And we released the helium balloons at the end. And I just thought, this is so tacky. And afterwards, they're just all saying how meaningful that was. And it just struck me to go, actually, we know how to do this. We know how to be able to offer good ways of people being able to tap in and acknowledge their grief and to show that love that they had for this person. And yet, why do I do that there and not in a normal funeral service? Which possibly people would also say that was really helpful. Yeah,
that's really interesting. Yeah, I guess to wrap this conversation up. amongst all of this at the moment, where do you find the hope? Where do you find the things that you're grateful for amongst?
I said this in church on the first Sunday I came back after having some time off for be with my sister and then the funeral. I was surprised at just how meaningful were the messages sent to me from people saying, I'm thinking and praying for you. You know, sometimes we go, thoughts and prayers, blah, blah. But when you're in the moment, to know that somebody is thinking of you enough to send a message to you or praying for you, I don't know, it just blew me away. It was just deeply meaningful. And I found myself responding, thanks, that means so much. And it sounded like a simplistic answer, but it wasn't. It was actually, this was so meaningful, so helpful. And I guess that just highlights, that sense of being part of a family or a community that's there for each other, that you have your backs in the good times, but also the tough times, to know that you've got people around you as you're going through something difficult is just huge, And yes, of course, my faith played into that as well, to know that God was there for me. But in the moment, that was being reflected through the people around me. And that was incredible. Just so meaningful for me at that time. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, definitely. And that almost brings it full circle back to that first conversation we were having about the value of church community.
Yeah.
With grief and dying, that's the perfect example of where church community can play such a huge part in people's lives. You, just by virtue of being a disciple of Jesus, you are plugged into this network of other people who care about you and will be there for you in those moments. Well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining me. This has been really enjoyable.
It's been great to be here. After listening to many, to be actually in the room, it's been fantastic.
Yeah, we will have to have you back at some point, hopefully with Ness as well. I'd love to just be in the room for that. That'd be fantastic. And thank you for listening and watching. If anything that we've talked about today has resonated with you, that has sparked anything for you, we'd love for you to get in touch if you'd like. You can find us on socials or just email us directly at filthyhopepod@gmail.com. That just about does us for this week. Thank you once again. If people wanted to find you, is there a way that you're online that you connect with people, or are you more of a...
If you Google Phil Swain or Turramurra Uniting Church, you'll find all my contact details. Yes.
Great. So if you want to get in touch with Phil about anything we've talked about, you can do that as well. Thanks for joining me. Thank you for listening. Have a great week. We will see you next week.
This is a prayer for the people who want to give up, who have been hurt beyond repair and cannot bear to see your face in anything. Find peace in letting go of the guilt that is in yours, and find hope in understanding. Life is not a game you have to win. Forgiveness overwhelming, salvation undeserving. You are loved by someone.